A little earlier this fall, my husband and I had the good fortune of spending a few weeks in Ireland. It was my first visit, and we left eagerly one evening, flew all night long, and landed on the Emerald Isle as the sun rose early in the morning. It didn't take us long to get our rental car in the Dublin airport, and then we headed out from the urban streets into the countryside. Within 30 minutes, we were driving through the hilly, wild countryside of the Wicklow Mountains. And it didn't take long for us to start running into wildlife in this wild countryside. There was a massive deer just regally standing in the middle of the very narrow, wall-lined street in the countryside. We stopped and we stared at him until he decided it was time to leave. And then a fox came a little further down the road and scurried across the road. And then as the trees dispersed and the sky opened before us, we started to see sheep and more sheep and even more sheep dotting the hills as we drove through the mountains. We came to a particularly serene spot, and there was conveniently a little pull-off area where we could park, where we could get out of the car and walk down to this beautiful babbling brook that was running down in between these luscious green hills. And all along the sides of the bed of this creek were sheep. Sheep grazing, sheep napping, little sheep couples hanging out and enjoying the creek and the beauty. We thought it didn't get any better. This was exactly what we were hoping for when we signed up and bought our tickets and went on this voyage. But then, cutting through this picturesque moment that we were having, came loud, booming rock music and the screech of tires on gravel as this Volkswagen Jetta skidded into a stop beside us. And out from the car emerged this really raggedy, disheveled-looking man. He had a cigarette just dangling from his lip. I'm not sure how that was happening, how the physics of that happened, because he wasn't gripping that cigarette, it was just dangling from his lip as he yelled and hooped and hollered, waving his arms wildly, saying, "Sheep, sheep, 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 sheep." I think that's what he said at least. And the sheep started listening, and the sheep were moving as he called them and waved his arms wildly with that cigarette still just dangling from his lip. And just as quickly as he skidded in, he hopped back in his car, slammed the door shut, and the rock music faded a little further down the road, where we watched in the distance as he jumped back out of the car again, hooped and hollered a little bit, as the sheep herded a little further up the mountain. We could see him for one more stop up the road, where this time he didn't even get out of the car. We could faintly hear his rock music still, and then we could hear his calls as he hung out the window of his Jetta. This Irish shepherd dude totally doesn't fit with the serene picture that I have always had in my mind. I was expecting a shepherd in flowing robes and equally soft, flowing long hair, the picture of peaceful calm, with an equally calm and peaceful sheep draped over his shoulders. You know this picture of Jesus, right? It is hung in just about every church I have ever been in. And this is the only image of a shepherd that I have ever seen or known. That is, until my visit to Ireland and my encounter with the shrieking, disheveled, smoking, crazy driving shepherd, when he showed me something else altogether. Then again, perhaps he wasn't really a shepherd. Perhaps he was one of those hired hands instead. In our scripture today, we join the story in the middle of an address that Jesus is giving to his disciples and to the crowd that is gathered around him. In the Gospel of John, there's this pattern of Jesus performing a sign, such as the time when he was teaching and a large crowd had come planning to hear him, only they hadn't planned very well. Or maybe Jesus talked longer than they thought that he would. And it came to lunchtime and they needed food, but among all of those gathered, there were only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The sign that Jesus made that day was the miraculous way that he took a little bit of food and multiplied it, so that all that were there ate their fill. And then, after performing the sign, the witnesses of the sign talk about what they have just witnessed, trying to make sense of it all. And then the third step of the pattern is that Jesus gives often a lengthy explanation of the meaning of the sign. For the example that I just gave of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus made sense of the sign by saying, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus makes these "I am" statements that reveal to us who he is, and in doing so, what it means to be in relationship to him. He says things like, "I am the gate," and "I am the light of the world." And with each one of these, he is showing he's showing us more and more about who he is and who we are too. Here in this passage, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." Actually, he says it twice, just in case we missed it the first time. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. And I lay down my life for the sheep. In the sentence that comes immediately before he makes this declaration, Jesus says these powerful words, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." The good shepherd's care for us is rooted in this desire that the sheep not only survive, but thrive. And all of this sounds pretty fantastic to us, right? Because in this metaphor, we're the sheep, and we're the sheep of the good shepherd's flock, and those sheep have it pretty good. As we hear these words, we can hear echoing in the back of our minds the words of the 22nd Psalm. Green pastures, still waters, nothing to fear, protected and secure under God's care. I don't know about you, but I have never felt so at ease with being compared to livestock. The Good Shepherd. This is an image that we can picture in our minds even if we've never encountered a real-life shepherd. We understand what a good shepherd is. We long for a good shepherd, and we can embrace the truth that Jesus is revealing about himself, that he cares for the sheep, knowing them so intimately that they know his voice. In just a few verses prior to where we picked up this passage in the gospel, it says he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out, and the sheep follow because they know his voice. The good shepherd is known, trusted, and followed by his sheep, and he protects them, even with his own life. But then Jesus keeps going, and he starts talking about other sheep, sheep that don't belong to our fold. And isn't that just like Jesus? Just when we start to relax in his comforting and promising words, he makes us think about those other sheep, those outsiders. He surely never lets us enjoy our insider comforts for very long before he starts making us think about others. He says he must bring in those others also, that they too will listen to his voice and follow. This is where that pattern I was talking about becomes really important in understanding what Jesus is saying, because he is making a direct reference here to the sign that he has just given. The story of the sign is one of my favorites, in part because of the grody factor that it holds. It's a fun one to tell to a small child. There was a man born blind, and when Jesus passes by him one day, some of the religious leaders stopped him to ask whether the man's blindness was because of his own sin or if he was paying for the sins of his parents. Jesus refuses the premise of their questions and without explanation spits on the ground, bends down, and makes mud from his saliva and the dirt. And then he smears it on the eyes of the blind man. He finally speaks, and he tells the blind man to go and wash off, which the man does. And when he comes back, he can see. Well, people don't know what to make of that, and they start asking questions. The man gives them the play-by-play, recounting the story, how someone rubbed this warm, wet goo on his eyes and told him to go wash off, and that when he did, he could see. But that doesn't satisfy them. So they ask more and more and more questions. They drag his family in to question them also. And with every investigation, the man, who was once blind, seems to see more clearly. In the climax of the story, the religious leaders are grilling the man and asking him pointed questions about who Jesus is. He replies to them that he doesn't know whether Jesus is who they are saying he is. But then he goes on to say, "One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." When the religious leaders drive him out from the community, Jesus goes and finds him. And the man who was once blind hears his voice and matches Jesus' face to the voice, and he confesses his belief in him. The man who once lived in darkness has seen the light. The man who had lived what at best could be called a half-life now could experience abundant life. The man who had lived on the fringes of his community has been restored to full personhood. The man who had been driven out by the hired hands is welcomed into the flock of the Good Shepherd. The truth of who Jesus is, as he says, "I am the Good Shepherd," is stunningly beautiful. And the storytelling of the Gospel of John is rich and meaningful. If we were to flip just a little further into the future in the Gospel of John, we would find Jesus visiting with the disciples after his resurrection. We would hear his conversation with Simon Peter as Jesus asks Simon Peter, "Do you love me?" Simon Peter responds to him saying, "Lord, you know that I do." And then Jesus said to him a clear directive, "Feed my sheep." This pattern is repeated 3 times and concludes with Jesus saying, "Follow me." In following the voice of the Good Shepherd, the sheep become shepherds themselves. But will they be good shepherds? Will we? You see, Jesus shapes our reality by asking us, just as he did Peter, to be the good shepherd now. Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." And if we take Jesus' words seriously, if we have heard, if we follow, if we believe, then we are to claim the role of the Good Shepherd too. Do we live like we are good shepherds? Or are we hired hands? Do we invite in or do we push out? Do we care for and protect, or do we question and fear and endanger? Faithful student of the scriptures that Jesus was, when he used this shepherd metaphor for himself, he would have been familiar with the ways the metaphor had been used in the Hebrew Bible. For instance, he may have known this passage in Ezekiel 34 where God is speaking and says, "Woe to you, shepherd of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost." Do we live like we are good shepherds? Could we? Or are we hired hands? Beloved sheep of the flock of Jesus Christ, join me in giving thanks for the goodness of our shepherd. And may we hear and follow the voice of the Good Shepherd, seeking out and welcoming other sheep into the fold. We are the Good Shepherd, beloved ones. Let's get to work. Amen.